transportation system plan. Hey, Matt, you want to give just an update about where we're at in this process?
Yeah, happy to. So we are, let's see, where are we? We are currently in the process of identifying the preferred alternatives for that'll essentially serve as the basis for the projects that go into the transportation system plan update. So going back a little bit, we early on in the process, we developed a series of goals and objectives and evaluation criteria that were largely used to kind of guide much of the process. We evaluated existing conditions. We projected out into the future and evaluated future conditions. And then we developed a set of alternatives to address all of the gaps, deficiencies, and needs that we identified along the way. Most recently, we have gone through the process of applying the goals and objectives to the list of alternatives. And from that, identified a series of preferred alternatives, used the evaluation criteria to then prioritize those preferred alternatives into a set of, I guess, high priority, medium, and low priority projects for the community. So that's about where we are.
Gotcha. And we have been doing this project for quite a while. Over a year or something at this point?
Yeah, we originally kicked the project off in January of 2020.
Gotcha. So here we are. We've gotten to a list of preferred alternatives that is available online. If you go to independencetsp.com, and I can even just show you that here. Let me share my screen. Oh, that's not a website. Here we go, independencetsp.com. You can see right here. You can see right here, you can participate in our open house number 3. Here is a link to it. You can get to that open house right there. You can also investigate a number of project documents right here. So this draft tech memo number 6, preferred alternatives, this document right here is really what we're going to be talking about tonight. Feel free to visit the site to look around there and offer any feedback that you have. So that's really what we're going to be talking about tonight. There is translation services available. Go ahead and call in if you would like translation services. Victor is standing by with anybody who would like to talk to him. So yeah, I guess, what do you say we get into it, huh? Perfect. And just real quick too, I'll just say a great big shout out and thank you to Jason Kistler, who is the IT support, the helper at the city. He does all sorts of things, and we would not be doing a YouTube live event without him. So Jason, thank you very much. So anyways, let's get into it. So I guess first, let's talk about some of the key issues that we have going on. So I think last time I showed this image, and this image is really fundamentally one of the big problems that we have. We just do not have a whole lot of east-west connectivity and north-south connectivity in the community. You can see we have primarily 2 major west and east routes through the community, Hoffman Road, and then Monmouth Street. And you can see that we have all sorts of these little tiny bits of east-west connections that don't actually connect, right? So we have a great deal of discontinuity through the community going east and west. We actually also have a great deal of discontinuity going north and south, but we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So what are some of the ways that you folks have recommended to improve east-west connectivity through the community, Matt? And I can show you an image like this right here.
Yeah, so this image is actually one of the figures from Tech Memo number 6 that shows some of the new some of the more major street connectivity within the community that we are trying to establish, primarily to provide connections between Independence and Monmouth. And much of what you see there, particularly in the southwest portion of the city, really comes from the Southwest Concept Plan, or small variations on the Southwest Concept Plan. The one that's located there furthest to the south, that's the new minor arterial that has been around since your current transportation system plan, or the one that's currently being updated, was created. That was identified as a need in the past, as well as some of the other north-south connections that are shown here. So just going from the south to the north, we have this east-west, this minor arterial that will ultimately connect Corvallis Road through Southwest Independence and into Monmouth. And the reason why it's currently shown as stopping there at the western boundary of the Independence urban growth boundary is primarily because we don't know yet where it's going to connect in with Monmouth. The previous TSP did show it going all the way over to Talmadge and connecting in with the streets over there. But since that time, it's harder to say whether or not that'll truly be the connection. So some of the other connections, just moving a little bit to the north, it's kind of in a little number there, but the R7, which is in the southwest corner, that's a connection that starts there at Gwynn Street and Talmadge, travels through the southwest concept plan area and connects in with the new east-west arterial. So the reason why they have taken this approach, and then Chestnut ties into that street, is primarily to minimize the number of crossings over the river, as well as just to kind of maximize the development potential in this area. So there's that connection. Moving further to the north, we have another east-west connection that starts at Madrona Street there in Talmadge, connects to 13th, and then weaves its way over to G Street. So the idea here is that G Street is one of our other higher classification streets, and that we could potentially provide a continuous east-west connection that starts on G and works its way all the way over to Talmadge. Moving up a little bit more, we do have we just show a small connection there, continuing F Street over to 13th. And then the last one that I'll mention there is the east-west connection along E Street. So this is one where we have recognized for some time now that Monmouth Street is going to pose potential challenges for active transportation along the corridor, and we'll spend some time talking about that here in a moment. So this street is largely intended to serve as that parallel route to Monmouth Street that'll provide some of those higher level or lower stress connections for people walking and biking along the corridor. Anything else you think I should highlight in there?
Yeah. Well, I do think that I think that that's good. So one thing I would like to sort of highlight is there has been some, I would say, misunderstanding about what is actually getting proposed at East Street, as well as potentially on G Street. Now, this is a 20-year plan. So we recognize that potentially this connection across the river, the South Fork, Ash Creek, is not going to happen in 20 years. But we do still think that establishing this road corridor through here is a really important thing to do. It's going to help us to actually achieve some of that continuity, that connectivity that ultimately will be beneficial. And we can always tie this thing into F here to get across the river or wherever it might be. Having that connection just seems like an important thing. And then East Street too, we really did originally look at trying to figure out if we could make this East Street more of a route through the community. And I think that what we've realized, and I'll say it wasn't our idea, it's actually something that's in the 2007 transportation system plan, was to make East Street sort of a parallel route to Monmouth Street. Now that East Street, right now, that is not what we're proposing. In fact, more of what we're proposing on East Street now is more of what we're terming an alternative modes Main Street. Would you want to describe what we're sort of conceptualizing as an alternative modes Main Street?
Sure. So it's much like it sounds. It's really just a street that emphasizes bicycle and pedestrian connectivity. So we would want to see continuous sidewalks on both sides of the roadway, and I think later on we might talk about a potential pedestrian pathway through this area as well. We'd also want to maintain it as a lower stress street for bicyclists and folks just traveling back and forth along this corridor. So it's just really maintaining some of the lower speeds, keeping the roadway relatively narrow, so maintaining some of the on-street parking, continuing to allow access along the roadway. I think fundamentally one of the biggest differences between East Street and some of these other streets is that East Street is still going to continue to serve as a local street connection that serves access and bicycles and pedestrians, and emphasizes connectivity, emphasizes access over connectivity. And so when we talk about the G Street extension, the new east-west arterials and collectors, those are some of the higher classification streets that are really emphasizing connections on a longer path. And while they will still provide adequate bike and pedestrian facilities, it's the emphasis is really on providing longer distance connections for motor vehicles.
Great. So, again, this is, oh yeah, I should say, if you have questions about anything that we're saying, feel free to type them into the YouTube chat or whatever you call that function there. And those questions will get to us and we will try our best to answer them. Yeah, and if we don't know answers, we'll look into it and we'll get back to you. So anyways, the question that I have is, again, this is a 20-year plan. And so as a 20-year plan, not all of these projects are going to get done. And ideally, when I look at this, I'm like, wow, this is a whole lot more connectivity. But I also recognize that a lot of these projects are going to occur incrementally over time, and they're not going to provide that level of connectivity sort of right off the bat. So my question is, based on that, what are ways that we can improve the amount of east-west traffic flow through the community on more of a short-term basis?
Boy, that's a challenging one. So without additional street connections, we're going to continue to rely much on Hoffman Street and Monmouth Street. And I don't know if you're trying to help me segue into one of the next sections, but what that means to me is that we need to potentially increase the capacity of Monmouth and Hoffman Street, as well as some of the major connections along those streets to improve traffic flow through that area. And so some of the points that you can see along Monmouth Street here, some of the intersections, the key ones being Gun Club, 7th, 4th, and Maine. Those are all key connections to this corridor where people are traveling to and from, and essentially serve as again some of the primary east-west, north-south connections throughout the community. So if you want to dive in, if you want me to dive in on those now, I'm happy to. But in terms of like the short term, until you get some of the additional street connections in there, we're going to continue to rely on Monmouth and Hoffman, and just need to identify some near-term improvements along those streets.
Gotcha. So we did get a question. The question was from a resident that lived on East Street. He says, so I don't need to worry about a major new traffic route for E.
No, East Street is going to continue to be a local street. It's going to continue to, which emphasizes local access primarily for residential homes in this case, as well as bicycle and pedestrian access and connectivity.
Perfect. Great. So I do appreciate what you're saying. I understand what you're saying on Monmouth Street. Essentially, to summarize, you're saying, hey, we have east-west traffic going through. It's a lot of traffic. Like I liken traffic to a pipe, right? Only a certain amount of stuff can go through a pipe. And we're trying to put a whole bunch of stuff through the east-west system. And so essentially we got to expand the pipe somehow. And what you're saying is by adding a center turn lane on Monmouth, that will help on Monmouth Street, that will help to get some of that stuff through the pipe essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Okay, so going on, let's talk about north-south connectivity a little bit too, because like I said, and I think we showed this image last time, like I said last time, we just don't have a whole lot of north-south connections either. If you think about it, really the only good way to get across Monmouth Street that's at a nice sort of controlled intersection is Main Street or 16th Street. And then when you think about it too, there's just not a whole lot of connectivity all the way across. So, you know, if you were to drive from Hoffman Road to the south part of Independence, you're pretty much limited the ways that you could go. Also, I'll just note, like, as you look at some of these roads, like some of the major roads that we could see maybe connecting to the north in the future, like 13th, it doesn't line up with Gun Club Road. 10th, if you continue that north, you're going to end up in the sewage lagoons. If you continued 7th north, you're going to run up into Pioneer Park and the junction of the South Fork of Ash Creek and Ash Creek. So we just don't have a whole lot of north-south connectivity either. And so I guess my question for you is trying to improve the amount of north-south connectivity that we have in the community a good goal? Is that a worthy goal? Is that something that we should be pursuing?
Well, of course, first off, because of one of the streets you've identified there being Main Street is also kind of one of your primary commercial corridors through the downtown area, serves a lot of your local businesses, and so you want to try to do what you can to pull some of the traffic away from there, just and or at least balance it out along the corridor, also or throughout the community. And so when you look, as you were highlighting there, we really have Main Street, and then we have Ash, the combination of Ash and 4th, and then you kind of jump over to Gun Club and 13th, if we assume there's a continuous connection between those two, and 16th. So the detention ponds there do serve as a bit of a barrier, kind of in the middle part of the community, and so you're left with these other connections. So one of the street connections I didn't talk about last time was that little S curve between Gun Club Road and 13th. So this is really this is one that's trying to make Gun Club and 13th Street sort of a more continuous north-south street connection that can serve as that longer term connection between Hoffman Road and potentially that new minor arterial to the south.
Right, and we do recognize that well, I guess I'll say two things. We know that people drive that way through the parking lot right now, and to get to that light. We also know that that connection is not going to go in without either that property, which is Central Plaza, going through some significant redevelopment, or us working with the property owner. So even though this is on the line or on the map, it's something that that we're definitely trying to capture here, but it's not saying we're going out tomorrow with some bulldozers and taking down Central Plaza.
Yeah, exactly. And one thing that's not really shown in either of these maps very well, just because of the scale of the maps, when you look at Independence and you look at the kind of the broader area, Independence and Monmouth, the two streets that really stand out is really Highway 51 that turns into Maine and Corvallis Road, and then 16th Street down to Talmadge Road. So those two streets, and you have to zoom out even a little bit further to see that those are the two streets. It doesn't really help on this one, but those are the two streets that also go all the way down to Stapleton to the south. And I know some folks are familiar with Stapleton. So when you look at it from a larger system standpoint, you really have these two streets that kind of bookend the community, Main Street and 16th Street, and they provide the furthest north-south connections. And then stepping in, you have 4th Street, and you have Gun Club and 13th. And then stepping in further, you really just have the north-south connections that are south of Monmouth, which is largely 7th and 10th.
Right. So what you're saying is Main Street and Corvallis Road right here,
Right.
and then Talmadge and 16th right here are really, I mean, they're the farthest north-south connections that we got.
Right.
Yeah.
And this might be the place where we talk about one of the other things that we had recommended is at this point as part of the preferred set of alternatives is identifying 16th and Talmadge Road as one of the future minor arterial roadways, as opposed to what's currently shown as Gun Club Road is currently one of the arterials. And the reason for that is really just shown right here on this map, is that 16th and Talmadge provides that greater level of connectivity north and south, very similar to Main Street and Corvallis, versus Gun Club and 13th, which are really constrained by existing development and potentially in the long term by the Ash Creek and other connections in the area.
Right. Right. So perfect. So is based on all of that. So we've sort of identified that improving this 4th Street corridor, just based on the fact that it's one of the few streets that could get you from the future Southern Arterial to Hoffman Road. We've identified that as a good idea. Can you explain the benefits of creating that corridor?
Yeah, so maybe a couple come to mind. One is that with that corridor in place, it does decrease the reliance on the highway and the commercial corridor through the downtown to travel north and south through the community. So if you're for example, if you're traveling east on Hoffman to Polk Road there, and you want to get into downtown, you can take Ash Street to 4th Street and access downtown, or you can continue over onto Main Street and travel to the south. Similar if you're coming up from the south on Corvallis Road, you can bypass much of downtown and much of Main Street by getting over to 4th Street and then traveling further to the north. And so that's just an example. Those are just a couple of examples. And then there's also multiple examples of how bicyclists and pedestrians and others that may want to avoid some parts of Main Street can utilize streets like 4th that are a little bit lower volume and lower speed and might provide slightly better facilities for travel, can also serve as part of that north-south corridor.
Perfect. So if we were to create something like a corridor on 4th, I mean, I know I've asked you this question before. It seems like that warrants some sort of intersection enhancement here. What is your thinking about what that intersection enhancement might look like?
Yeah. So these as we get further along, these questions become more complicated because we don't think about it within the context of how to get cars around and how to get other like through the community, we also think about the impacts it has on bikes and pedestrians and transit riders, and how it could potentially be limiting in other ways. And so when the just at the first blush, when I looked at this, I really thought that providing some sort of an intersection enhancement that would enable people to travel a little bit easier north-south across Monmouth Street would actually be a pretty good idea. And so something like a traffic signal or potentially a roundabout in this location would provide that, would make it a little bit easier for people to travel north. It may also make it a little bit easier for pedestrians that are looking to cross Monmouth Street to get to the elementary school there, give them like a signalized crossing or a designated crossing to get up there. So certainly something at that location could serve as that north-south connection. But with that said, there are some of the other things that we've been thinking about. Again, east-west, enhancing east-west connectivity, and some of the capacity on Monmouth Street. What we've landed on at this intersection, or what the preferred, what Tech Memo 6 shows here for this intersection as the preferred alternative, is largely just providing a center two-way left turn lane on Monmouth Street to increase the capacity and make it a little bit easier for northbound and southbound vehicles to make a left turn onto the highway. You could also do a variety of other types of treatments to make it emphasize pedestrian and bicycle connectivity across the corridor. And none of these, by the way, would preclude the potential for a traffic signal or even a roundabout. The challenge is that a lot of the capacity needs along Monmouth Street and at this intersection in particular are largely driven by the limited number of east-west connections in the community. So because we're relying so heavily on Monmouth Street to travel from the east to the west or vice versa, we're seeing a lot of challenges out here. That's why a lot of the dots on one of those previous maps showed them on Gun Club and 7th and 4th and Maine. So when we do have additional east-west connectivity, when G Street connects all the way over to Madrona, or whenever the new Minor Street arterial is in place there further to the south on Mount Fur, we do expect there to be a shift in some of the traffic that's traveling along Monmouth Street to that southern arterial or to that other east-west collector. And suddenly we see that some of those operational issues on Monmouth Street are not quite as bad.
Right.
So and long and short version of your to answer your question more directly is I feel like we do need something at this intersection to improve north-south connections for vehicles as well as for bicyclists and pedestrians. I do think that improvement has to be considered within the context of the larger system and the long-term potential for some additional connections that could make it easier.
Gotcha. So we did get a couple of questions here. One was, I like the idea of connecting G Street through further west, but I'm concerned how the Inspiration Garden would be affected by the plan. Let me see if I can find a good map to look at. Oh, there it is. It's exactly right. You'll see the Inspiration Garden. This is G Street right here. This is sort of showing a connection across that would essentially tie in somehow to going this way at a certain point. So the connection would essentially be where the parking lot is now. Again, because we're rebuilding the F Street Bridge, or we're in the process of redesigning the F Street Bridge right now, and that was funded through a state grant. I don't think that we're going to be probably doing a G Street Bridge in the super near future, but I do think that sort of identifying the corridor as a good sort of way through the community does make sense. Do you have thoughts about that, Matt?
Well, unfortunately, there are impacts here, And we would recognize, obviously, if you pan further to the west, you can see that, and I mean you can see it here as well, is that there's a business right here. There's the park, there's the creek, there's an existing business, there's existing residential developments even further to the west. So providing like a continuous east-west connection that looks like a typical grid street, kind of like F or pardon me, F or E or any of the other streets to the north, is likely not going to be feasible here. So we'll need some kind of a jog. We will need to cross the creek at some point. We will likely impact these businesses. So it is that comment was spot on there, that the connection is definitely needed, and unfortunately, just as you go further to the south, just the way that some of the other connections that we considered, like we considered I Street, which you can see I Street it goes straight off of the bridge. I Street doesn't have a rail crossing, and that's in most cases that's just sort of a non-starter. And then it also has the school that's in there, and then you start running into developments, then you have the creek, and then you have businesses, and you have a lot of other issues to deal with through there. Going further to the south, Spruce Street was previously identified as a connection, as a potential east-west collector. There's really no good way to tie Spruce Street back into Corvallis Road as well. So there's just in terms of providing continuous east-west connectivity, there's limited opportunities. G Street just happens to have a fewer barriers, I think, with respect to the park and the creek and the private development than some of these other connections have.
Right. It also has the benefit of when these houses, right, and I'm sorry, I think this is Sweet Cherry Lane right there. When these were developed right here, each of these dedicated to the city like 33 feet back here for a half street. So there was always the idea that a street was going to go back here at a certain point. The benefit of that is, I mean, it could tie into some new development here, help create a gridded street system, and it could help us to get some connectivity from here potentially over to 16th, even in the short term. Also, I mean, if you could get from here over even to something like 10th, you can hop on F and then get across the creek. So it does make a whole lot of sense to really start identifying that corridor, especially as development is happening, and really sort of holding that idea of that corridor out there. Thoughts about that?
No, I think you're spot on there. It's definitely something that's going to take some time, and that's one of the benefits of doing a plan like this, a 20-year plan, isn't that we're going to go out and start building it tomorrow. It's largely going to be dependent on when redevelopment is occurring in some of these private places, and a combination of the city coming in and identifying funding and building it to some extent. So there's no shortage of challenges with this one. But again, I would just emphasize the need for the connections.
Yeah. Now, another comment that we got is there are 3 public schools on 16th. So most people use Gun Club Road instead because there are not school speed zones.
Yeah. So if you're kind of thinking back to, if the question is referring to some of the change in the classification along 16th as opposed to Gun Club Road, it is a very fair point. It is something that we're acutely aware of, that there are schools out here, and that designating it as a minor arterial, and also designating it as a something we haven't necessarily talked about yet, but also as a freight and farm equipment route, is problematic in a lot of ways, and that's why one of the reasons why we still talk about this as alternatives, and we're not into the draft TSP and nowhere near kind of an adoption phase right now. So we're still kind of hashing out some of these issues.
Gotcha.
Oh, go ahead.
No, what were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say, so gun club, like we do think about gun club as a major north-south connection through the community. And again, today it is classified as, I believe it's classified as a minor arterial. For being able to provide that sort of S curve to connect Gun Club down to 13th Street would emphasize that being able to extend 13th Street as the Southwest concept plan or Southwest concept area redevelops will add a little bit more emphasis to that corridor. But I take you back to this map and just looking at this map and thinking about the level of connectivity that this map offers or that this map shows, and that 16th and Talmadge offers, really tell that tale. So that being said, I don't think that we would fundamentally change anything about 16th Street or Gun Club Road. It would just be, it's more of a recognition that the types of facilities that are needed along both of those roads are still going to largely emphasize connectivity, but also balance the needs of pedestrians and bicycles and the needs of local residents to access private property.
Yeah, I think that makes good sense. So one of the things, I mean, I looked into it sort of after we had early on talked about switching the designation. I went in and I looked at our street standards, and I said, what does that, I sort of thought, does that mean that we want a wider street out here on 16th? And really even the cross section for this street is the same for a collector and a minor arterial. So it's not fundamentally going to change the nature of the street at all, sort of based on our standards. All right, so seeing no further questions, let's just keep on going, and let's go back and talk about well, shoot, let's just go on to Maine and Monmouth. So Matt, I know that we have talked about the intersection of Maine and Monmouth quite a bit. We've talked about turn lanes with or without lights. We've talked about various iterations of turn lanes. Do we want three lanes on Maine? Do we want 3 lanes on Monmouth? Do we want one or the other? Do we want both? Do we want them with lights? Do we want them without lights? We've talked about couplets. We've talked about a couplet on C, a couplet on D. We've talked about a square about. We've talked about a rectangle about. We've talked about another rectangle about. And really, you folks have come down to 3 potential alternatives that are sort of the preferred alternatives. Would you please explain those for us?
Yeah. So the one, maybe starting with the couple there that are identified in tech memo number 6, and particularly the one that's shown here up on the screen, is providing a traffic signal right here in the middle of downtown. And so we recognize first off that this traffic signal is, well, let me say we recognize that there are some issues out here today, that we've been out here and we've sat and watched this intersection operate. Even in COVID conditions, we still see backing up in the north and south and the eastbound directions, and we still see quite a bit of congestion, particularly during the evening peak time period. So when you stretch that out over 20 years and you add on in the anticipated growth that we expect within Maine, or sorry, within Independence as well as Monmouth, in the general and the region in general, we expect this intersection to fail essentially. So worse than it is today, longer queues, long delays, and so we need something out here. And one of the first things we looked at here was we looked at like Fred was saying, we looked at a variety of different alternatives. The traffic signal is one that everybody's pretty familiar with what a traffic signal does, but a traffic signal is one that emphasizes each individual lane, or allows each individual lane to really clear out as best as it can over the within each cycle of the signal. And what we have shown here, as far as is just providing separate left and right turn lanes at the eastbound approach, with the combination of that and the traffic signal, do bring this intersection back into into standard, or which granted still allows a certain amount of congestion. In talking with ODOT about this one in particular, ODOT feels, and while they have some say in this, because obviously this is their intersection, they feel that providing turn lanes on Main Street would also be not necessary, but it would definitely increase the capacity of this intersection and allow us to fully utilize the potential of this traffic signal. So turn lanes on the highway, or turn lanes on Main Street, north and south of this intersection, would essentially would eliminate the curb extensions that you have there today, which increases the crossing width for pedestrians. It also would eliminate on-street parking for at least a block, if not a block and a half, on either side of this intersection. So a lot of the parking in downtown would effectively go away, which we obviously don't want to see that happen. And so this is not our favorite alternative. It's not a popular alternative. It just even amongst our advisory committees and other folks, it's just one that thoroughly works from an operational standpoint, just not from a lot of other standpoints. So hence all the other alternatives. And I don't know what the next slide is going to show here, or if, yeah. So this is another one of the concepts that's shown in the memo. And this concept essentially is like a roundabout in a lot of ways. That's why we call it a rectangle about. This eliminates the need for a traffic signal at Monmouth and Maine, in part because a lot of the movements that exist there today or would exist in the future are eliminated. And in particular the southbound movements through here. Granted, it does require a significant amount of I'll say out of direction travel in order to get to where you need to go, but it's but again, it's kind of like a large roundabout. So this one also has some challenges, and some of those challenges include operating the highway and part of this rectangle about on 2nd Street, which includes a rail line, and what the impacts are going to have on some of the on-street parking hasn't been fully evaluated, and the impact again that it has on the rail line hasn't been fully evaluated. But it is still a pretty promising alternative that we want to keep. Something we like about it in particular is the C Street and Plaza, converting C Street into more of a plaza space that would provide a nice tie-in to the waterfront area. So, and again, I'm not sure what your next slide is here, Fred, but this is another one that we've spent a fair amount of time talking about. So getting back over to emphasizing some sort of a connection on the 4th Street, and recognizing that today, in order to bypass the downtown area, people do use F Street, D Street, and others to get over to like 4th and to 7th and find their way back up onto Monmouth and continue to the west. And they do the same thing from the north. And they'll turn down C Street and get over to 4th or 7th and find their way to Monmouth and continue west. So providing some sort of an enhancement there at 4th Street, or a traffic signal at 4th Street, we would assume that we would allow these types of movements to occur and shift the traffic down on D Street and C Street or to 4th Street or to 7th Street and allow it to occur this way. It's a little harder to guesstimate what that would do to Maine and Monmouth Street, but our assumption here is that just we would emphasize this larger system-wide approach and try to capture multiple issues all in one shot, as we talked about before, emphasizing north-south connections, parallel to Main Street, providing a way to get back and forth across Monmouth at 4th Street, and really just increasing the capacity of the intersection to accommodate vehicles as well as bikes and peds. So I don't know if you have another one beyond
Right.
that.
No, so I mean, I keep on, I mean, I've thought about this way too much. And is it, I mean, what do you think? Is it possible that this would this help sort of alleviate some of the issues at Maine and Monmouth?
Our assumption is yes, and it's in part again because it's something that we know people are doing today to bypass the downtown, and would just sort of emphasize this as a route to get around downtown. It's kind of like establishing a couplet without really establishing a couplet. It's sort of like recognizing that C Street and D Street serve as a parallel route to get around the downtown area.
Yeah,
So
and
oh, go ahead.
I think one benefit of it is the fact that, you know, locals would probably know about it. I mean, even in some of the comments that we got earlier, somebody said that they hop on 4th and then G, and they said it's really easy. I just remember 4G, right? And I thought, wow, that's funny. That's cool, right? So, anyways, so people are already doing it, and so it would essentially formalize what people already know to do. Now, one of the things about that I've especially heard from businesses in downtown is they don't want to take some of the traffic away from the downtown area because, you know, especially like visitor traffic or that sort of stuff, it means business, right? And so they don't want that traffic to per se go away. But, you know, if a local knows a different way to get around the downtown area, perhaps that's actually a good idea. I don't know. What do you think, Matt?
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. It does, like you say, formalizes an existing route in a way that a lot of people are traveling there today. It doesn't necessitate us to convert C Street and D Street to one-way streets in any way, although I suppose you could. It doesn't, and it doesn't. In the end, it doesn't have as much of an impact right there in the heart of downtown. That Main and Monmouth Street intersection it's the way that it is today with the curb extensions and the pedestrian crossings, and despite some of the congestion around the intersection with the long queues and things, it really does contribute to like a nice cozy downtown feel. And so our concern of having something like a traffic signal in that location is that it would disrupt that feel a bit. But there's something I'm kind of keeping in the back here is that something I've mentioned earlier on is that again, providing some additional east-west connectivity south of Monmouth Street, providing a continuous connection on G, or more importantly, providing a continuous east-west arterial south along Mountain Fir, really does offload a lot of the traffic on Monmouth Street. And suddenly some of the operational issues that we see at Monmouth and Maine, at 4th and Monmouth, and at 7th and Monmouth largely go away. And so it's when we talk about some of these alternatives, we want to talk about them in terms of like the larger system, and recognize that anything that we do in the near term we don't necessarily want to preclude the potential for the long term, and do something that isn't going to be necessary. So like, dropping a signal in the middle of downtown may not be necessary if you have the additional connections to the south.
Gotcha. Right. I suppose that makes sense. It's kind of like my pipe analogy from earlier. You don't need a really super big pipe if you got a whole bunch of little pipes.
Yeah.
All right. Perfect. All right. So we did get some questions. One was my concern with using B Street, and I assume that's for the rectangle about. Would be delivery trucks to the market that often block the westbound lane. So there's that. There was another comment. There's an awful lot of semi-truck going through town and large farm equipment during harvest times that would have difficulty navigating the roundabout. Is this part of the discussion?
It has been. And one of the things I mentioned earlier was designating 16th Street as the freight and farm equipment route. So there's always going to be a need to serve the downtown from with freight traffic to some extent, just for deliveries and things. But the trucks that are traveling through we would prefer them to use. From the north, we'd prefer them to use Polk over to Hoffman, and potentially down to 16th if they need to get to Monmouth Street or Monmouth in general. And then from the south, we'd prefer them to use the new east-west arterial again over to Talmadge to get back up to the north. But in the more in the near term, there is still going to be some a need to get through here. And so, and Fred, I'm kind of going to start talking myself in circles here, but I believe that the intention of designating 16th Street as the freight and farm equipment route is really to is both for through traffic for the freight, but also for local farm equipment to travel north and south. So ideally, we wouldn't see farm equipment come through this way.
Yeah, it's funny. There's people that are really mixed on it. It was, I don't know if I told this story last time. There was some people really like having the farm and freight equipment going through the downtown area. I mean, it's always kind of a little crazy, like when you're out there and you got a big old giant something or other, I don't know, farm machinery, right? But it's going down the street and it takes up like quite a bit of it, right? And so it's always kind of like, whoa, that's kind of cool. That's interesting. Some people really value that. Some people also really don't like it. There was a local farmer. I was standing outside of the bakery and talking to folks, and a local farmer walked by, and I was talking to him about routes or whatever, and I asked him about farm equipment routes, which way he would go through town. He's like, "Are you kidding me? 16th." So I thought that was pretty funny. You didn't need to pay a consultant for that. So
thanks for that, Fred.
Well, no, that's what he told me.
Yeah,
yeah, that's pretty good. I value public outreach for that reason. So another comment that we got is any option needs to respect and preserve the historic resources in the downtown area. And I think that we've heard that pretty loud and clear throughout this process. There's also been a number of people just really advocating for business interests down there, and not doing something that's going to be stupid for business. So we definitely have heard that.
Yeah, and I'll just take that back to the traffic signal. While the traffic signal does again offer it addresses the issue right at the point of Monmouth and Maine, and it does make things. It would improve conditions at the intersection from an operational standpoint. So queues would be shorter, the delay would be shorter, but the potential impacts of the signal it can't be ignored, and particularly if you start thinking about turn lanes and the impact the turn lanes have on street parking and the curb extensions and all that kind of stuff. So we're still thinking about these larger system level options or alternatives that don't have as much of an impact there. And yeah, all the rectangle abouts, the square abouts, all these different alternatives that we've considered as well. We recognize that again, parking is really important in the downtown, and particularly for accessing businesses. So we don't want to do anything to take away that on-street parking.
Right. Perfect. Another comment that we got is, I like the 4th Street idea, as it will also help children cross over to the elementary school and allow school buses to enter and exit safely. That's very true. That's one of the benefits of the whole idea of the 4th Street idea. And it's we got another comment: a roundabout at 4th and Monmouth would impact 3 of the most important properties in our National Register Historic District.
Yeah.
So would you, I mean, could you, how big is our roundabouts typically, Matt?
Yeah, so we've mostly, when we talked about, first off, mostly when we talked about an improvement here at 4th and Monmouth, we've mostly talked about a traffic signal. And in part, if not entirely, is because of the footprint of a roundabout. And just looking at this, I don't know if you have I don't know what, you're in Google Earth, so you can't draw a circle on here, but the roundabout at a minimum would take out the corners, all 4 corners of this intersection, and maybe measure from the outside edge of the crosswalk to the outside edge of the crosswalk.
Outside edge of the crosswalk to that, right, like that?
Actually, I meant, yeah, you can go that way as well. So that's 76 feet. What I would stretch that out to 90 feet, try to center it in there, and imagine that that's the circle. So that's probably the smallest roundabout that you would potentially get would be about that big. And that is the inside part of the roundabout. So that doesn't necessarily account for any sort of landscaping or any sidewalks that are on the outside of the roundabout, as well as the need for how the roadway would approach them. So while it may not hit the houses necessarily, it would definitely have an impact on the landscaping. You may lose the tree in the southeast corner, and potentially the tree in the southwest corner. And I may have, yeah, southeast and southwest corners. Those sort of larger trees might be impacted by a roundabout, but it's not going to get to the houses necessarily.
Gotcha. Perfect. So let's see what's next. Curious, give people a second to maybe respond to anything else on that intersection in downtown. Now, the idea of the plaza on C Street, is that idea precluded in something like the improvement to 4th, or could something similar happen? Or, I mean, is the plaza concept only associated with, is that only achievable under the rectangle about idea?
Well, on a permanent basis, like if you wanted to establish a permanent plaza there, then I would say, yeah, it would. I would want this street to accommodate vehicles that are looking to bypass Monmouth and Maine and Monmouth in general to get over to 4th or potentially even further. So I'd still want to maintain vehicular access through here for that. That being said, that the notion of like a festival street or a plaza or whatever you want to call it, you can always, and I think you guys do this today, is you can always design the street to quickly become become a festival street or a plaza street and shut it down. It's not part of the highway system. It's not part of like it's not part of the main east-west connection through the community. And so depending on the time, you may not want to shut it down during the weekday evening peak commuting period, but a lot of other times, whether it's on the weekend, whether it's like during a special event, I think that in those cases, it would be fine to shut it down.
Yeah, that makes good sense. All right. Is there anything else that we should say about Maine and Monmouth before we leave it?
I think I would just want to reiterate that going back to the very first thing that we talked about needing additional east-west connectivity, it's, if anything's become more apparent throughout this process, is that the east-west connections are really, really important, particularly when you think about where a lot of the future development is going to occur. And one thing I know we've talked about, I may have even mentioned before, is that when we looked into our crystal ball and we forecast what the future was going to look like out here, and we looked at all the potential future development and where the traffic was going to be going to and from those future development sites, a lot of the traffic comes right through this intersection. And that's primarily due to a limited number of east-west connections, as well as some north-south connections in the community. So additional street connectivity is really, really key to offloading the highway, offloading this intersection, and safe and smooth traffic flow through the community.
Right. So if we want Main Street, if we want Monmouth Street to continue to be the nice sort of neighborhood sort of feel streets that we know them to be and that we value them to be, we need to really pursue connections wherever we can get them, is essentially the punchline.
Exactly.
Perfect. Great. Let's go down to the next intersection. So wrong one. All right. River Road and Main Street. Your preferred alternative for this is an always stop with a left turn lane, and every direction here would be stopped under this alternative with a stop sign. You're showing a left turn lane here southbound, and you're also showing a right turn lane here westbound. But I think we recognize that the westbound right turn is not likely for a while. Could you explain this alternative and sort of the implications, what it means on traffic flow and all of that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is another one of our intersections that we identified as having both existing safety issues as well as long-term operational issues. There are some near-term or existing operational issues as well, just not as bad as some other areas. So definitely one that we need to address as part of the transportation system plan. And like the other intersections, we went through a number of different alternatives, and we considered traffic signals and roundabouts and other things. And I won't discount anything at this point. But what we've sort of settled in here on the preferred alternative is what we would consider to be a relatively low impact alternative. Providing an always stop does allow for more of the traffic to and from the bridge or from River Road there to get onto Main Street and Corvallis. The turn lanes are really just emphasize the movements, the heaviest movements out here. So the heaviest movement is the southbound left turn movement from Main Street onto River Road, and the westbound right turn movement from River Road onto Main Street there. And so I'd say within the horizon of the transportation system plan, or within the next 20 years, the most likely improvement that you'll see out here is going to be that southbound left turn movement, along with the always stop control. And that actually does improve operational, the operations at the intersections in terms of vehicle queues and delays and things. but what we also want to try to emphasize here is that in the long term, which in the very, very long term, which likely extends beyond the horizon of the TSP, is the need to provide an additional lane on the bridge. So if you look at tech memo number 6 and you look at this particular project, you'll see that it's about $195,000 to provide that southbound left turn lane and all the other stuff we want to do out here. And it's not $50 million, which is probably what it would cost to add a lane onto this bridge. I'm not a structural engineer, so I can't really say for sure what that would be. But what we've put forward as our preferred alternative is the southbound left and the more in the near term, and then the westbound right or left turn lane there in the longer term when the bridge is redeveloped.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is that the intersection would work with always stop control, and then just that southbound left, that's going to get it a long ways to actually perform it quite a bit better.
That's correct.
Now, I'm curious, if we put stop signs out there right now and stopped at all directions, would that improve transportation on and off the bridge?
It does. I'd say more potentially more off the bridge than on the bridge. I think today you have free access to for your southbound left and your northbound right. Those guys get right on the bridge. And the longest queue today that you see, it's about 300 feet or maybe longer, is the people waiting on the bridge to get onto Maine or down onto Corvallis. So your northbound and your southbound approach on Maine and Corvallis would suffer a little bit, but your westbound approach would improve.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Now, one thing that we've heard about is a roundabout. People like the idea of a roundabout at this location.
Yeah.
I know that you folks considered a roundabout at this location. Why was that not the preferred alternative?
Well, in part because this works, and this comes with a relatively low cost. I mean, absent the need to widen the bridge. The southbound left turn lane again is about $195,000 all in on everything we want to do here, versus a roundabout, which would probably be in the 1.2 to 1.5 million dollar range. And that doesn't include the right-of-way impacts and the need to potentially purchase additional right-of-way and or reconfigure the bridge to accommodate the roundabout. So I do like the roundabout here for a lot of reasons, in part because you don't necessarily need the turn lanes. You just have the the people are just circulating around the roundabout. So depending on where you locate it and how you orientate it, you may not need an additional lane on the bridge. You may not need an additional lane on Main Street there, but it just has such a large footprint that it really at the level that we were able to design one for this particular intersection, it was starting to feel like it was going to have a lot of impacts.
Gotcha.
So backing off from a roundabout, we also considered a traffic signal here, and I wouldn't say that we've totally discounted the traffic signal at this location, potentially in the long term as well. A traffic signal here, and this is something that we've talked about with ODOT, and I think during some of our previous conversations, is we had a hard time getting to a place where we were going to warrant a traffic signal based on all the warrants that we need to meet to get there. But if we think about the orientation of the intersection a little differently, if we think about the movements, we could potentially get to a traffic signal here as well. But I also like to think of, at least I tend to think of an always stop as in some cases as an interim improvement before you get to a traffic signal. It does buy you a little bit more capacity, particularly for the westbound movement, and can carry you through the horizon year. So I'm rambling, but to sum up, this improvement is the lowest cost, lowest impact improvement that buys you the longest life on this system.
Gotcha. I think that makes sense. Now let's go to the next intersection, Polk Street and Main Street. Now the preferred alternative here is a turn lane and a stoplight. What are some of the things that you considered here to get to that alternative?
Yeah, so we did consider a number of things here as well. I think probably the most notable, I mean, aside from the traffic signal, again, another roundabout, and we're not just trying to drop roundabouts everywhere, but we are considering roundabouts where it makes sense. In this particular location, the challenges, the biggest challenge is really the multifamily home in the northeast corner of the intersection. It's right up against the backside of the curb, and based on where we originally were trying to locate the roundabout, it was likely going to impact that particular property. It also does take up some of the right of way in the north and on all four corners of this intersection to get it just right. Also, the challenge with the roundabout here is that we do anticipate this to be, as I mentioned earlier, we're designating this area as a potential route for trucks to get to and from this from Main Street and onto Polk and ultimately to Hoffman and to further to the west. So the round, like in order to accommodate a roundabout here, or in order to accommodate trucks at a roundabout in this location, it would need to be pretty big, and the center of the roundabout would likely need to be mountable. So a lot of the aesthetic benefits of a roundabout might be lost in this case. So we settled in here on a traffic signal, and in this case, we also added the left turn lane again to accommodate trucks, but also just to try to get the most benefit out of the traffic signal. And you can see that it does have an impact on this property in the southwest corner, and we would in all likeliness, the way that the staging of this traffic signal or the way that this signal would likely go in is it would largely be contingent on when that property in the southwest corner gets developed. So if it or gets redeveloped. So if the signal goes in before the property gets redeveloped, then you likely won't see that left turn lane right away, but the signal would be set up and the poles would be located in such a way that you would not preclude the potential for the eastbound left turn lane. And or if the property redeveloped before the signal went in, we would stripe in this left turn pocket and allow it to live on its own until the signal came in. So so the signal is not without impacts to adjacent properties. It just happens to again kind of it serves this intersection, we feel like, better than a roundabout. That being said, and I should add this caveat to all of our intersections, is one of ODOT's philosophies for identifying intersection improvements in transportation system plans is to not necessarily be really prescriptive about what that improvement's going to be. So in this case, we're identifying a left turn lane, or eastbound left turn lane with a traffic signal, but in all likeliness, there will need to footnote this or caveat this and say that the ultimate improvement at this intersection will be determined based on coordination with the Oregon Department of Transportation or something to that effect.
Yeah, sounds good. I appreciate that. A number of people voiced support for some sort of improvement here just because of things like speed on this road and the fact that there's kids crossing from the apartments on the east side of the road to the market and everything on the west side of the road fairly regularly. I see a lot of people using this as a crossing. Basically, either approach, a roundabout or a traffic light, is going to improve pedestrian flow through this area, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, okay. Also, I think that this intersection, and we've sort of talked about this, I think that this intersection is a possibility, at least, to make sort of a connection in our non-motorized systems. So how would you accommodate something like a bike through this intersection, Matt?
Yeah, so I know I promised you that I'd come up with a solution before we got together today. I don't have a great solution out here, in part because it is kind of narrow as we approach it from the west. And we do, as you're traveling down, Polk there, as you're approaching the highway, when if and I think what you're referring to is when we want to go further to the east and connect with the trail along the riverfront. We do want to do something to provide some connectivity through this area. So I think in the short term, what I would do if I were biking out here with my kids is I would likely, even though there isn't a sidewalk here, I would likely get off the road, and if I didn't get off my bike, I would likely get off the road and utilize the crosswalk. I think that's probably the best way to get through here today, and potentially, depending on how Polk ultimately develops, it might be part of the longer term solution as well.
Gotcha. Yeah. So, I mean, ideally, and I think we can see it better in some of the maps here. Let me get a good one. You can see right here on this map, Hoffman Road right now, it does have bike lanes, and they're fairly wide. Potentially we could make them even wider just with some additional paint. We could get bikes down here, but ultimately at Ash Street, those bike lanes just go away. And you're sort of contending with freight traffic and whatnot. Then you get to that intersection. I've biked it. And it's kind of like, what do you do now? What do I like? It's one of those feelings like, man, I don't know what I should do from here. And ultimately, it would be great if we could take this the trail going north to the sports park and ultimately pull that up to that intersection and then connect that to that Hoffman Road and actually create a nice little bike corridor there. But yeah, really that intersection is a challenge. One thing I think ultimately, and we'll get into it as we're getting more into the low stress network, one of the principles of the low stress network is we have a great north-south route along the river right now. It's a beautiful route. It's great. I saw people riding bikes and whatnot out there today. What essentially we would like to do is use that as a spine and then create a series of routes off of that can then come into the rest of the city. And ideally Hoffman would be one of those, or something would be one of those. But yeah, really that intersection at Polk right now, Polk and Maine is a challenge to that.
Yeah, and I would only add to that, and something that I should have mentioned before is that Williams is a potential alternative. It sort of fits into your spine analogy. There is that getting away from Polk and Maine, maybe taking Ash Street down to Williams, taking, I think it's Log Cabin Street, or any one of those north-south streets down to Williams, and then coming across on Williams, you can also access the trail system from there.
Right, exactly. Perfect. All right, so a couple of intersections that we haven't heard a whole lot about, but we're getting some comments on, include Gun Club and Hoffman. Now, at the last Traffic Safety Commission meeting, I actually am newly on the Traffic Safety Commission, Matt. So I went to the last one. It was my first meeting, and we heard that there was in the last 3 months, 3 intersections at Gun Club and Hoffman. One of them was a multiple injury accident. We heard a comment on our social media that the intersection of Gun Club and Hoffman needs separate right and left turn lanes. We also heard a comment, I would like to add the intersection of Gun Club and Hoffman needs to be addressed. School children and walkers have a hard time crossing safely at the intersection, so it'd be ideal to have a blinking light system so they can notify drivers of walkers need to cross. Now, what are your thoughts about Gun Club and Hoffman Road?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, when we looked at this, when we did our initial analysis, I mentioned that we had done, as part of our existing conditions analysis, we looked at traffic crash history in the area, and we looked at this intersection, and this one didn't get flagged at the time as a potential safety issue. Although we do recognize, and we have heard throughout this process, that speeds on Hoffman Road are a bit problematic, and we have heard previously that this intersection in general is a bit of a problem. I think what we've identified in Tech Memo 6 as some potential alternatives out here, or just a variety of what we would call more on the lines of traffic calming alternatives. And so these could include everything from speed feedback signs at the approach to the intersection. I believe today, as you're traveling down Hoffman Road, the speeds are posted at 40 miles per hour, and they don't actually change to 35 miles per hour until you get further to the east of Gun Club Road. So first thing we need to do is sort of reconfigure the roadway to encourage those lower speeds by providing some narrower travel lanes, getting the buffered bike lanes out there like we're intending to do. Do what we can to get the speeds down into the more 35 mile per hour range. Move those signs, add the speed feedback signs, and then we could also do things like, I think one of the other ones we have in there is identifying the intersection ahead warning signs. So these are pretty common, and essentially just highlights that there's an intersection that's approaching. That in this case it'll be Gun Club roads when you're on Hoffman Road, and those are just a small handful of potential safety treatments you could do out there. One that is not in the memo, but just jumped into my head as we were talking, is there's these treatments that are being used in more rural communities when you're approaching an intersection like this, and the name is, I'm not going to get the name right, but it's like a through route activation warning system or something like that. There's a clever acronym for it, of course, and that and what that is essentially it's a blinking light that's either on Hoffman Road that indicates that there's a car waiting on Gun Club Road. So there's like a detector on Gun Club Road that picks up the fact that there's a car, and then it'll send an indication to the light system on Hoffman Road that'll flash and say that there's a car waiting there. And then there's, in a similar vein, there's another one where there could be a blinking light on Gun Club Road that tells you whether or not there's a car traveling within a certain distance of the intersection on Hoffman Road. So those would be set back far enough so that a car sitting on Gun Club Road could safely turn out before without the light. Gotcha. So those types of systems are ODOT uses them again predominantly in rural areas, but they can be very, very effective.
So so the whole idea of a left turn, a separate right and left turn, would something like that work out here?
So if you're talking about a separate left and right on Gun Club Road, then it's probably not as critical just because that's the stop controlled approach. So you probably don't need the left and right on Gun Club Road. That would be more of a capacity-based improvement. That's not going to improve safety out there.
Mhm.
But a left turn lane and or a right turn lane on Hoffman Road, what that essentially does is that separates the slowed or stopped moving vehicles from the through vehicles. So if you have a left turn lane, you can you can get in that left turn lane while the people can blow past you. Or if you're slowing down, you're getting into a right turn lane, they can then blow past you. So really, whenever we select treatments like that, so yeah, very similar to what you see right there. When we select treatments like that, it's just really a reflection of the types of crashes. And so you say there were 3 recent crashes. If those 3 recent crashes were all the result of people rear-ending somebody else while they were waiting to make a turn, then yeah, that could potentially be an alternative. But it would look an awful lot like this.
Mhm.
So you would end up with this is exactly what it would look like for a left turn, and for a right turn, the only thing you right about where your hand is you would just have some additional pavement there to provide the right turn lane in.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, I mean, so this is Hoffman and 16th. Really, what drove this improvement is a lot of what would drive an improvement here. I mean, they're very, very similar intersections, it seems to me. Yeah. Um, uh, all right, and then we also heard a comment about um, signalizing the left on 16th and Monmouth. Currently, there is no left turn signal when you're at the intersection, and so it's you have to wait until some of these cars are through. It makes it difficult, especially I imagine at school times, to get the left here. What would drive a signalized left, Matt?
Yeah, so a signalized left. Great question. I'm stretching my mind to remember if this was one of our study intersections or not. But if it was, it wasn't failing in our long-term analysis. But that said, to get a signalized or what I'll call a protected left turn movement, because today you have a signalized left, it's just permitted. So permitted means that you're allowed to turn, but you got to wait for somebody. Protected means that you can turn with your own protected arrow. To get a protected left, ODOT has very specific thresholds for when you need those. Some of those thresholds have to do with things like whether or not there's adequate sight distance. Sight distance is how clearly can you see along the roadway. And you can see right here from this aerial shot that you can see pretty clearly. So the protected left turn movement is largely going to be driven by volumes. So you need a certain number of left turn volumes in either direction in order to get that. And if you put me on the spot, I'd say I think it's usually a combination of left turn volumes and opposing through volumes before you get that left. Because essentially what you're trying to do is like how much capacity is there for a left turn movement there. And if it did happen, and I can look up while we're talking here to see whether or not it was one of our study intersections. I should know that off the top of my head. But if it was not, or if it was, then we could quickly tell you whether or not it's anywhere near a warranting a protected left turn movement.
Cool. All right. So I think it was a study intersection. So yeah.
Okay.
So based on that, hopefully, if anybody has any questions about any of those other things, any other transportation in the city of Independence, we are more than happy to answer random transportation questions. You can just shoot those on the chat on the YouTube, and we'd appreciate it. We're going to be here for at least a little longer because you know what? We're just now going into bike and ped transportation, and this is something that we've definitely tried to address as part of this update. There's a couple of goals that we have here. One is on some of these major roads to make the bike infrastructure as wide as possible, potentially reallocate some of the space on the existing roadway toward more bike infrastructure. I'll particularly point to Hoffman. Hoffman right now is quite wide, and the lanes are quite wide. So you could potentially expand out this bike lane relatively easy on Hoffman Road. Some of those are relatively easy. I'll just also point to Main Street over here. Main Street, especially going north out of town, I mean, you can see it in this aerial photograph right here. You very rarely see someone parked along Main Street going north out of town, especially before Polk. What that does is it makes the road feel really wide. That's about maybe 42 feet from curb to curb. Because it feels so wide and because you're leaving downtown, people start flying, right? So people start driving pretty quickly. So it does seem like certain roads are kind of no-brainers for improving some of that bike space on the major roads. Some we're planning on doing as part of future development. I'll point down to Corvallis Road, right? Where right now, currently, Corvallis Road is only sort of partially improved. Also, Stryker Road is only partially improved right now. Development, little by little, has improved that road. But some roads, it's just a straight up challenge. And I'm gonna point to Monmouth Street. So what are the plans for Monmouth Street, and how can we best accommodate bikes on Monmouth? Uh-oh, you're muted.
Sorry. So starting with the hardest one first here, Monmouth Street is definitely a challenge, and for a variety of reasons. The most significant of which is that there are kind of two versions of Monmouth Street. One, I'll just say, just generally speaking, is east of Ash Creek, and then the other is west of Ash Creek. And so today we really want, or in the future, we really want to try to maintain the same characteristic of Monmouth Street east of Ash Creek as it is today. So we don't want to fundamentally change that roadway. But so that means that anything that we and I would say it's not entirely different on the west side of Monmouth Street either. We don't want to do a whole lot of widening out here if we can avoid it. But most of the alternatives that we've considered, and most of the ones that would actually make this what we would consider to be a low stress facility, do require some widening. So let's jump over to you can just pick a spot anywhere on Monmouth Street west.
Do you want to be west or east first?
Let's start with the west.
Okay.
So in this area, what we have is we have a what we would about a 44-foot cross section curb to curb, and so that's already pretty narrow. That means that we have and I believe, if I have this right, we have 11-foot travel lanes in both directions, a 12-foot median, and 2 5-foot bike lanes. And so that adds up to 44 feet, and that's about as narrow as you can get in an ODOT facility in a number of different contexts. And so there's not a lot of space that we can be reallocating out here in order to make this to make these bike lanes a little bit wider. There may be some areas where it sort of ekes out a little bit more than 44 feet. And in some areas, we might be able to get a little bit more room in those bike lanes. But really, in order to improve conditions out here, we're going to need to widen something. So all the alternatives that we've considered, whether it's a buffered bike lane or a cycle track of some sort, do result in the need to widen the street by at least 2 feet in each direction, which is not a lot, and comes with a huge cost, especially if you consider that it's fairly consistent and goes for quite a ways. One of the other alternatives that we've sort of knocked around, and Russ, pardon me, Fred, I hope this doesn't surprise you at all, but it's something short of a cycle track out here would potentially just be elevating or elevating or creating multi or shared use paths on both sides of the roadway. So when I mean both sides of the roadway, I mean just taking the space that's currently being used for on-street bike lanes, elevating it up to the level of the sidewalk, and creating it in there. So it's not an uncommon thing to do in most areas where you see stuff like that. You would also see little indicators on the ground, what goes where the bike space is, where the pedestrian space is. And essentially you would have, like, again, shared use paths on both sides of the roadway. That's probably the only alternative that doesn't require a significant amount of widening, but it does require a significant amount of investment to get those in place. So those are largely the alternatives that we have out here. Like, in the near term, it's really just trying to eke out as much space as we can for the bikes. When any sort of resurfacing occurs, or any kind of like restriping occurs out here, just eking out as much space as we can. And if pending a significant redevelopment of the roadway or windfall of money from ODOT providing like some sort of widening and providing buffered bike lanes, or raising them up and providing shared paths on both sides. One of the other alternatives, and I'll mention if you want to go back to the map, is that just recognizing that this street is part of a larger system. And while we want to continue to provide bike facilities on this roadway to provide provide a place for people to bike on Monmouth Street, we've also talked a lot about, and we've talked about really early on in this, is providing a continuation of E Street from 16th Street further to the west, and particularly all the way over to Monmouth, and then allowing E Street to be the low stress parallel route throughout this corridor. And that's the other maybe it's sort of near term, long term ish alternative, because obviously we need to provide this continuation of E Street to really emphasize the full length of the connection. But in the sort of shorter term, it is an alternative.
Right. I mean, yeah, the East Street idea as being sort of the alternative low stress street, really it did come about specifically because we realized the limitations that were associated with trying to get bikes on Monmouth Street. So yeah, that's definitely part of the inspiration of the East Street idea there. Now we have a couple of questions here. I guess we could take them. One is, realizing this is not in the city, but a very real concern for Independence residents. Do you have any insight to improvements coming to the dangerous intersection of 51 and 22? It's not something that we've talked about as part of this project, but Matt, do you know anything about that project?
I don't. I am aware of a potential facility plan or corridor plan that is, I don't know how far away it is in terms of like when it might potentially start up, but I do know that it is on ODOT's radar currently, and they are trying to figure out how they might go about approaching this one.
Gotcha.
So it may
And
still
then,
be a ways out, but
gotcha.
it is on the
And
radar.
I know that the mayor is always working on that intersection. He realizes that that intersection is vital for city residents. So you could always give the mayor a call, and he would be happy to tell you what he knows, I'm sure. Um, uh, Also, we got the question. There has been some discussion about a trolley between Monmouth and Independence. Was that taken into consideration when looking at future traffic volume?
No, not necessarily. It is it's definitely something that could be considered, and a lot of the some of the things that we're not talking about today necessarily are could fall into this a very similar category. So tech memo number 6 does talk a little bit about transit and does talk about the trolley. It doesn't talk about the potential for either of those services to alleviate traffic on the highway, but it is a very real thing. One of the other things that we've talked about in tech memo number 6 is something called transportation demand management, as well as parking management and emerging technologies. Each of those things collectively can also be reducing traffic on Monmouth Street and introduce needs of their own. And so, in a lot of cases, we're assuming that all those things essentially bring down demand and improve traffic flow to some extent. So what a lot of the alternatives we identify and a lot of the things that end up in transportation system plans, like the need for a traffic signal, for example, they come with a caveat. And that caveat is always when signal warrants are met or when approved by a statewide traffic engineer. And so those things, so that means that we're not going to, that the trolley, that the enhanced transit service, that the TDM strategies, all those things combined can do their job, and they have the benefit of and potentially show some benefit out here on Monmouth Street long before we go about installing major capacity based enhancements. I hope that satisfies your question.
That
That's a great question.
I think it's a great question too, because I mean, ultimately, I mean, when we talk about road capacity, we assume that people are all going to be traveling in cars and whatnot through the intersections and whatnot through the future. Um, but you know, if people are traveling in other modes and whatnot, then perhaps we don't need to make the roads as big. Or if we figure out different ways to get people around more efficiently, then in fact we might not need again the massive pipe. If we have a car going through a pipe versus a bicycle, you can get a whole lot more bicycles through the pipe than a car, right? Just based on size, or a bus or whatever that might be. Or
Yeah.
even better, people working from home, right? People working from home has no impact to the transportation system, right? So yeah, all of those things definitely impact how the whole system works. So no, that's a great question, great follow-up there. I appreciate that. Now let's talk about east of Ash Creek now, and what you're anticipating for bikes in this area. And I'll let you talk more from a system perspective here.
Yeah. So again, much like west of Ash Creek, we want to be able to provide a continuous low stress facility on Monmouth Street. The challenge that we have again here is largely by what's built out there today, how much room we have curb to curb, and what's needed. So on this side, we don't have the center turn lane, although we do feel like it's a capacity enhancement that's needed over the long term out here. And so in the near term, we could potentially see some bike lanes, or we could continue to utilize the space for on-street parking. But in the long term, and the horizon of the TSP, or what we're ultimately aiming for in the TSP, would be a center two-way left turn lane out here that basically runs from about 7th all the way down to 4th, and then tapers back before you get downtown. And so that, combined with the need for travel lanes in both directions, really does eliminate the possibility for adding on-street bike lanes on this corridor. So again, we're back to this. We're back to where we started, which is that needing to provide additional capacity on Monmouth Street to accommodate travel through the community because of a lack of east-west connectivity. So we have a center two-way left turn lane out here that will help to provide capacity, increase the ability for people to turn left and right off the highway, and essentially eliminating the ability to provide on-street parking. Because as you look to the north and you look to the south, a large part of this built-out environment is, as somebody noted earlier, is largely historic and something that we want to try to maintain. So if you go back to when you get a chance there to go back to the map, I'd say that our plan here is not unlike our plan further to the west, which is to rely more heavily on parallel routes to really provide the low stress facility through this area. So the traffic volumes on Monmouth Street are higher than we like to see for a shared roadway, but the speeds are low enough that some folks might feel comfortable riding parallel to the at least parallel to the cars. Other folks are going to want some kind of a lower stress parallel facility. So in this case, we're really emphasizing C and D Street as potential bike routes that parallel the highway. So once you get past Ash Creek, sorry, I'm fading here the wee hours of the day. Once you get past Ash Creek, you would turn left, or you would, if you're traveling east, you would want to turn right, get down to D Street, and then travel to the east along D Street. If you're traveling, if you're intending to travel to the west, you would take C Street, get over there to like 7th Street, and then work your way back further to the west. This is all within the context of E Street also being sort of a continuous east-west low stress facility through the area as well. So it's again, it's while we're trying to maintain the character of the roadway, while we're also trying to utilize this roadway to its fullest capacity or potential for providing east-west connections, it really does sort of force us to a parallel route to provide the bike and the bike facilities in particular.
Yeah, that's great. So before we talk a little bit more about that low stress network, can you explain sort of, let's take, how would you envision sort of bikes in downtown?
Yeah, in downtown, this is likely just to be entirely a shared environment. So the thresholds that we use for using shared streets, it really has to do with volume and speed. And from a speed standpoint, we're definitely low enough. We're 25 miles per hour and below, and so we're a low enough speed that bikes can usually travel right along with cars pretty comfortably. And in particular in the downtown area where it's already it's kind of the way you want bikes to travel around in the downtown is right there in the middle of the lane, taking the full width of the lane and traveling the distance there. So but one of the challenges is through this area is the volume. So the volume does exceed the minimum threshold that we typically like to see um, for shared roadways, and that threshold varies depending on what jurisdiction you're in. But generally, it's about 2,500 to about 3,000 vehicles per day. And through this area, you're just in excess of 5,000 vehicles per day on both Main and Monmouth Street through the downtown. So we're really pushing the limits of having a shared roadway through the downtown. So that's why, again, we would really be looking for people to utilize some of these. The people that are comfortable riding in higher volume traffic can continue to use downtown. The people that are wanting to use some of the lower stress, lower volume, lower speed streets can utilize the rest of the street network to kind of bypass the downtown.
Gotcha. Would you mark it with Sharrows, or I can't remember if that's in the.
You can. There's one of the things that we don't see them as much anymore, and I believe that in some contexts they're now frowned upon, but there was briefly a period of time where people were using super sharrows. So it's like a sharrow itself isn't necessarily a bike facility. This if there are any bike wonks on the line, they're not going to like this, but I'll say it anyway. Is that a sharrow isn't a bike facility. It's a pavement marking that is intended to really provide a continuous like a continuation of a bike facility that is that that ends in one place and maybe picks up again in another way. It's kind of like wayfinding in a lot of ways. It positions you in the street, tells you where to ride. It reinforces to motorists that bicycles are supposed to be in the street. It does a lot of there's a lot of good behind a sharrow, but I wouldn't consider it to be like a bike facility per se. I don't think super sharrows are a bike facility either, but what a super sharrow does that is just like it sounds is that it really reinforces the placement of bicycles in the downtown. So some communities, and this is one in particular that is no longer in. There for a brief period of time, it was a bit of a fad to stripe a green line down the middle of your roadway and drop sharrows intermittently to emphasize the bikes there. But green has become is more or less used now as a restriction for vehicles. So we don't like to see those green stripes anymore. Then they kind of went to a green box underneath the sharrow. So there was like a full-on green box under the sharrow, and some of those still exist today. And I can think of a few communities where they're using those. I think the city of Ashland down in Southern Oregon puts them in just a year or two ago through their downtown, a pretty good stretch through their downtown. And then getting rid of the green altogether is just a sharrow with a couple of skip stripes on both sides, and then closely spaced. And so those are the like super sharrows. And in some cases, we've recommended those be used in downtown environments where you can't fit on-street bike lane, but you want to really emphasize the ability for bicyclists to go through here.
Yeah, I mean, I have heard from some of the bike community that they would value something like that, just to let people know that they are allowed in the street, that's where they're supposed to be. Because we specifically have little things on our sidewalks that say don't ride your bike here. So we're telling them not to be in one spot. It'd be nice to tell them that they are allowed in another spot.
Yeah, I think if I was going to use the word recommendation, which I don't know that I would recommend them in the downtown area. I definitely wouldn't. I wouldn't argue against them at all. I think, for all the reasons I just said, they definitely reinforce the placement of the bicyclists in the roadway. But I would use them. I definitely would recommend, or I'd definitely be using them on some of these parallel streets to really same thing, to reemphasize the need for, or the ability for bicycles to be right there in the middle of the road, but also to serve as sort of wayfinding for folks so that they can follow the sharrows around and recognize that we're really trying to direct them around the downtown and around the streets that don't have bike facilities.
Right. I think that's a great point. I mean, that makes tons of sense. Now, so we only got a couple of minutes here. I'll let you go at 8, but so if you've got questions out there, anybody listening, feel free, if we haven't addressed your question, feel free to type it in. We are here to answer questions. Yeah, so we have been talking about a low stress network. And I mean, I really do think that this whole idea of a low stress network is really part of what we're really trying to get to, like for pedestrians, for bicycles, for even elderly on scooters. Can you explain what the low stress network is? That I mean, what does that mean, and how are we trying to? I mean, this really is trying to get to that low stress network here. Explain what a low stress network is and who it's intended to serve.
Okay. Yeah. One quick thing I want to insert in there, just recognizing that we are running out of time, is make sure to direct. I'd like people to know that there is a open house going on right now on our website. Fred mentioned it really early on, but just to reiterate that. And the online open house includes a lot of these same maps and a lot of the same, it covers a lot of the same information that we've been talking about, but also gives you lots of opportunities to jump in there and make suggestions about things that you like to see in the community. That all this stuff, we are still at the alternative stage. We're preferred alternatives, but we're also at the alternative stage, so we're still soliciting input on everything.
That open house is available at www.independencetsp.com.
Thank you, Fred. But to jump back into the to the low stress network, a low stress, just I guess kind of like it sounds, it's a term that we're using to describe a roadway that feels comfortable to a broad range of the public, and this includes people that may otherwise not be choosing to bike or to walk because of the way that the roadway is configured today. And so we're trying to create a network that really encourages people to walk and to bike and to be active in general. And in order to do that, you really need to kind of think beyond what is beyond what's out there today. And so a lot of the streets that are shown here in green, maybe with the exception of Gun Club Road and actually maybe just with the exception of Gun Club Road, don't have bike lanes on them today. A lot of these are just on-street parking or limited on-street parking in some areas, but are largely just used as roadways to get around, and bikes share the road or ride on the sidewalks. But to really emphasize bicycle connections in the community, you need to establish a network of facilities that is like integrated and provides a continuous network of facilities that where people can get around. And so the blue are where we have designated buffered bike lanes, but we could exchange that for cycle tracks, exchange that for other types of things. The green is where we have bike lanes, and I should say that today most of these streets are relatively low volume and relatively low speed. But in the long term, when we look at the 20-year planning horizon for the transportation system plan, a lot of these streets do exceed those thresholds where we like to start seeing on-street bike lanes. Very few of these streets will be able to accommodate bikes in a comfortable way in the long-term plan for the DSP. So you start needing these bike lanes more and more. And you can also see on this map the little purple lines and the pink lines that are shown on there. These are all the trails that we have planned as part of the network, and so they're all integrated with the bike lanes. They're all integrated with the sidewalk networks, and these all will help to really complete those connections.
Right. That sounds great, Matt. I mean, yeah, what you're saying there is really we're trying to create a system that sort of parallels the whole vehicular system, but actually offers people a way to get comfortably from point A to point B in the city of Independence. That's ultimately the goal of this low stress network. So parents with kids can hop on a bike and they can ride into downtown easily, or kids can ride to school, or a grandpa can go hop on his scooter and get to groceries, right? That's essentially what we're trying to do with some of these alternative routes. By doing some of this, I mean, it's going to make transit work better, and hopefully just it will help improve even vehicular traffic in town by taking some of those trips that would otherwise take a car and putting them on some of this alternative network. So I guess based on that, we can sort of leave it there. I had more questions. We didn't even get to transit. But hey, Matt, I sure appreciate you talking and answering questions with us. I sure appreciate what you've done putting this together. Again, the open house is going on at independencetsp.com. That's www.independencetsp.com. You just come to this site, you can hit the open house link, and you are right there, and you can see everything that you might want to find out about connectivity. You can leave comments on maps. You can leave comments in drop boxes. And if you're having trouble figuring that out, you can give me a call. I'm here at City Hall, and I am more than willing to talk transportation anytime. So yeah, I guess that's it. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. Jason, thank you for running this thing. And Victor, thanks for offering translation services. Sure appreciate it. I guess that's it for us tonight. Yeah, I guess we'll see you next time.